Welcome to the Billion Insight podcast. I'm your host Shree. Today we have a very special guest whose name is Brian Sachetta, who is uniquely blend the world of code with the complexity of human mind. He's the author of the Get Out of Your Head book series, where he turns psychology and personal struggles into simple, powerful strategy to manage anxiety and depression. He also is a software developer, which is proving that mental health and logic can go hand in hand. Today, we shall explore Brian's insight on mental health and personal development, uncovering how his unique experience in both technology and writing have shaped his approach to overcoming challenges and supporting others on their journey to the well-being. So, without further ado, let's welcome Brian Sacheta to the show. So, welcome, Brian. Welcome to the Billion Inside podcast. How are you?
Hey, Shree, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Thanks for joining, man. I'm also good. As a tradition in our show, we often start with our guest childhood. If you don't mind, can we start from your childhood? You were born and raised in US, right?
That's correct. Born and raised in the Boston area in Massachusetts. Went to high school in a town called Linfield, small town in Massachusetts. Went to college at Boston College, which is just outside of Boston in Chestnut Hill. And I have been mostly living in the city of Boston since then, which was, I think, 13 years ago now. I do spend a good amount of time in Florida, and I did live there for a year. It gets cold up in Boston, so it's nice to escape the winter, get some nice rays of sunshine and all that.
That's interesting. So now is the May. We are on the mid of the May. How's the temperature currently in Boston?
So this is the time of year that you want to be here, and we just left the period where you don't want to be here so much. So we have somewhere between 4 and 6 months of really nice weather coming up, and it's warm right now. It's raining today, but in general, May is a really nice month. So luckily, we have a lot of good weather ahead of us. We've got the
Yeah.
summertime, and Boston is a great city to be in the summer. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Interesting. How was your formative years in US?
They were good. I mean, I would say that I was pretty lucky, like grew up in a upper middle class family, went to a nice high school, didn't go through anything too horrible other than, anxiety and depression, didn't have any tragedies in my life or anything like that. So I was certainly fortunate. I have one brother or one sibling, and it's my brother, two wonderful parents. So, grew up in a nice household. It's funny because, I think one of the things with my writing and with my books was early on, I kind of would look at my life and say, I have a pretty good life. Like, I shouldn't, or at least I tell myself I shouldn't experience mental hardship, anxiety, depression, that sort of thing. And yet I still did. And so it took me a little while to reconcile that and be like, you can have a really nice life and still experience those things. And that's okay. And kind of not resisting that is part of the journey as well. Getting yourself towards healing rather than saying, I shouldn't be experiencing this thing for one particular reason or another.
In which era did you grow up in US?
Technically, I believe I'm a millennial. So, I went to high school I think I graduated in 2008. I like to say, right, is I was lucky enough to graduate high school and also college right before social media became like a huge thing, the thing that it is now. And I say that from the standpoint of, I mean, it must, and I know it must cause kids these days a ton of anxiety and also, comparing themselves to one another and leading to depression just by virtue of everybody's on social media all the time. You go to a party, right?
Yeah.
And in this day and age, everybody has a camera phone, a really good camera phone. And so you're always being recorded or the threat of being recorded. And then having that video go out to your peers, to your community is always there. And so, not that it like gave us an excuse to do bad things, but I can't even imagine what it would be like now where you would almost be looking over your shoulder everywhere you go, thinking, oh, what am I going to do today? And let's be honest, right? If you're 15 years old, like you're a kid, you do dumb things. Kids do dumb things, So it's like, it's tough in this day and age where it's almost like kids don't have the chance to be kids, right? Because they're always being monitored. And that's really difficult. And I think we've seen through, different media and books and in the news and all that, kids struggling a lot these days with anxiety, depression, feeling like they're not part of the group. And some of that is just being a kid in general, but a lot of that is heightened by the technology of this new era.
Absolutely, man. Social media is kind of ruined their childhood, I would say. As you mentioned, they kind of feel pressure at very early age, which wasn't the case with the earlier generation. So we will touch on that. Let's come to your profession. So you are a software developer. How you become interested in computer science and in psychology? Because those are completely two distant fields.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's times where I'm like, yeah, I don't even know. But if I give you a real answer, right? So I was always interested in entrepreneurship and building businesses, running companies, that sort of thing. So as I got to college, and when I was in high school and middle school, like I ran small businesses, like very small ones. I would sell my own stuff on eBay, and I would sell. I would go to friends and family members, and I would sell their stuff as well, and get commissions for that sort of thing, right? So it was always interesting to me, the idea of running my own business, starting my own business. And as I got to college, it just became apparent to me that technology enabled that sort of thing quite a bit. So I started saying to myself, I'm like, okay, I was in the business school for my undergraduate degree, and I'd be taking finance classes and accounting classes, and I understand that you need to learn some of that requisite information, but it just wasn't that interesting to me. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, how do I get more into running a business, building a business, that sort of thing? And eventually I learned about computer science, and I was like, well, I knew, I knew about computers and applications and websites and all that. And it was like, at first I would just kind of try to build my own website without really having any idea what I was doing. And then eventually I was like, okay, if I could take some classes on this, that would facilitate things quite a bit. So I started taking, like, classes in Java and PHP and web development, and then eventually mobile development, so in iOS. And that was really cool to me, where you could basically take an idea that was in your head and you could make it real, right, by writing code, designing things, and you could ship a product off. Like, one of the first products I ever made was a game that ran on the iPhone. It was like a little arcade game, and to me it was just so fun. It was this nice escape where, like, I could really just kind of immerse myself in the code, in the project. And I look at it nowadays and I'm like, that's what writing is for me today, where I have this safe haven that I can go to. I can really focus on this task, and I can kind of turn my mind off, right? I can escape from some of my own anxieties and that sort of thing. Going
Yeah.
back to the question of, like, okay, so second part is, like, how did I get into psychology? I mean, I find psychology fascinating. I think that I love to know the way people tick, and I love to think about, sometimes it's a little unsettling, or it's harder to do on yourself than others, but it's interesting to think about your own motivations and why you do or don't do certain things. And we all have a propensity or an interest to live a good life, right? And so there was a point in, I'd say, college again, where I found myself, like, relatively unhappy. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing this engineering work, and I'm trying to figure out how computer systems and computer applications work, that sort of thing. So I have this engineering mindset, if you will, a way of looking at the world. And with that lens, I kind of looked around and said, if I'm not happy right now, or if I'm not where I want to be, or if I want to get to the place that I want to be, there has to be some sort of framework for getting myself there, right? Almost as if you could engineer your way towards fulfillment or whatever it is. And I'm not saying that is 100% true, but it was at least that inkling that led me to be like, let's figure out, let's take some courses in psychology and kind of explore that field a little bit. So those two things started in college for sure. And I'd always read a lot of books related to the mind, psychology, human happiness, behaviorism, stuff like that. And eventually it just kind of reached a head where I was struggling with my own mental health for a long time. And as I was reading these different books, and I'm working on software projects and kind of just living my life, but also, going to therapy and reading journal articles and all that sort of stuff, and immersing myself in the literature, eventually I got to the point where I was like, through these explorations, I have learned how to better manage my own anxiety. And I've also, done a lot of stuff on the product side, where I feel as though I could write a book, I could come up with a brand, that sort of thing. I could marry these two interests that I have. And that's where the idea for my first book came about. And since then, it's, that, I guess that was somewhere 2015, 16, 17, that sort of thing. You're constantly chipping away at a product that you're building. But since then, in the last 10-ish years, right, I wrote another book, have appeared on a lot of podcasts, and I just for me, it's just kind of scratching that itch, that intellectual itch of wanting to know more and more about how products work, how computers work, how the human mind works, how do we find ways to better our situations, that kind of thing.
So your engineering background helped you to explore the psychology in a different lens.
Think I definitely see that a lot in my own life.
So, in the past, we have featured many psychologists. When I saw your name in my forum, the first reaction was okay, so there is another psychologist. Then I was kind of digging your profile. Then I found out, right, you mentioned that you are a software developer. Then I thought a software developer and a psychologist, what a combination. I find out your book, which is, by the way, received very rave review, which is a popular one, I would say. Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Then I realized that you are not a trained psychologist, but with your own experience and your interest on psychology, you wrote that book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess the way that I look at it, right, is I definitely would be more well qualified, right? I think people would find my books and be more open to them. I don't know what the percentage would be, but some percentage of people would be more drawn to them if I was, a trained psychiatrist, psychologist, if I had my PhD, that sort of thing. For one reason or another, I think some of it is financial in the sense that like you find I've at a decently young age or like early into my career, I found a solid job or a pathway of earning income, and you kind of get accustomed to that, right? I live in Boston; it's a very expensive cost of living, and so the idea of like going back to school for a number of years and getting my PhD, like that's interesting to me to go learn those things, but at the same time, you're giving up that salary, and then you're also paying for the
Yeah.
degree. So like, I don't know if I'm committed enough to getting the degree to do that.
Yeah.
At the same time, how you had framed it was I take my experiences, I talk about them in hopes of serving other people and helping them with their mental health. That is exactly like my brand and my approach. I consider myself intellectually driven in the sense that like even though I don't have that degree, like I have read a high number of books on psychology, right? I keep a list of all the books that I've read. I think in the last 12 years it's close to 1,000, and most of them are nonfiction geared towards psychology. And so I hate to say these things because I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I do just have a sense of confidence in that I know this material and I'm pretty well informed on it. That makes me feel as though I am able to report on it, right? So even
Yeah.
though I'm not a psychiatrist, psychologist, that sort of thing, I consider myself an investigative journalist on mental health, on
Yeah.
anxiety, on depression. It just so happens that I started the journey with solely like my own experience, right? And it was like, okay, I've gone through anxiety, I've gone through depression, I've tried these things worked, these things did not. And that in that alone, just telling your own story, a lot of people do that. That helps you start the brand, write a book, gain a little bit of a following, have some legitimacy, like a little bit of legitimacy online, right? Because you're like, I've dealt with these things. So at the very least, this is what helped me. It might not help other people, but I'm telling my story. In the years that have followed, like I've really tried to lean into learning more and more about some of the deeper parts of psychology and the science behind it. And so I think like, I don't know, I think that comes out during these shows. And I want to just make sure, right, that I am trying to be as informed as I can be, and I am in turn as helpful as I can be to other people. I want to
Mm.
be able to explain things from not only like a personal experience kind of standpoint, but I also like to infuse some of the science to say like, hey, for those that are inclined towards that sort of approach, here's how we make sense of it. And here's some of the legitimacy behind it, right? To be like, this is how the brain works. When you get into this certain state, these kind of things happen. When the brain starts running in this fashion, these other things happen. So to me, it's just a way of building more legitimacy and sounding as though it's more legit, because that's what I'm trying to do, right? If I'm coming out and talking about these things and folks are like, oh, he just doesn't sound like he knows what he's talking
Yeah.
about, then I'm not reaching those folks, and therefore like they're turning away. I'm not able to affect them in a positive fashion.
Yeah. Yeah. By doing this, you just gaining more credibility. People started believing you and taking you more seriously because as we discussed that either you have to have a physical degree or you have to show the world that you know the skill, you know the thing, which you mentioned that you have spent thousands of hours reading books related to psychology. You also mentioned that you done a management or financial course in some point of your life. That also helped you put it in a way so that people can acknowledge you. Because sometimes you know that if you a glass of water, if you put a sugar on it, it will not visible unless you project it that, hey, look at this is a sweet water. Otherwise people will see that this is just a regular plain water. What's good about it? They just will be ignored altogether.
Yeah, and it's a good point that you make. I think it's kind of fascinating. You see as you get older and you learn more things, right? You learn things that seem unrelated, right? Kind of disparate fields and topics. And then eventually you get to the point where you're like, oh, I'm starting to see how these things are coming together in my life and I'm fusing them. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is like, yes, we talked about how software development, product development is very different from psychology. It absolutely is. But maybe, right, somebody is studying disparate topics or fields in their own life, and eventually they might be able to find ways that those things come together. For me, it was like, okay, I'm building products, right, and trying to figure out like, how do I serve up a user experience that is not only palatable but also like enjoyable? Somebody wants to come back to that. So that's sort of like brand building, if you will, right? That's like branding in a general sense. So
Yeah.
then I say, okay, well, now I have these engineering insights, I have these psychology insights, I have my own personal experience. I tie all those things together, and hopefully it is basically creating a brand, right? So like when you look at my
Yeah.
books and you look at my website and that sort of thing, I'm like, I can see all the individual pieces that went in to be like, oh, it now makes sense that like putting together a book that appeals to people,
Yeah.
that's a product of all those experiences that I've had. And I think for listeners, it can be interesting to, sometimes you take a course where you're like, I don't see the value in that or anything like that. But eventually, those things can come back around and serve some new importance to you. So, obviously, if you're like, I have no interest in some certain field whatsoever, then you probably don't want to go down that path too far. But at the
Yeah.
same time, if you have interests that are disparate from one another, you never know how they'll come together and serve you in the future.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, people all the time, they have one core thing that they kind of depending on, but in the same time, they're kind of doing the other thing. Like they are maybe interested in sports. They kind of debate about it and all. But in your case, the thing which intrigue you, you kind of explore that in a way that you can produce something out of by your own. Then you kind of find a way to monetize it as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say that it doesn't, kind of speaking to the listener, it doesn't always have to be money related. I think a lot of this is like you explore what you find inherently interesting. And if that turns into something else in the future, that's great. But if you think about it, right, is, there's a lot of times where like I've had friends that have gone into the field of like investment banking and they're like, the job totally stinks. The hours are brutal. I don't enjoy anything about what I'm doing, but it's going to pay off one day. And
Yeah.
everybody approaches things differently, but my approach has always kind of been like, and sometimes I stray from this a tiny bit, but like if there's no enjoyment in what you're doing and you're on that path for a while, eventually you're going to look back and be like, not that it was necessarily a waste, but like that's part of your life that you don't get back. And
Mhm.
that's part of your life that you didn't reap as much enjoyment from as you could have, maybe no enjoyment whatsoever. And I think that like it's just a cautionary kind of tale, right? I don't think you want to go down that path too long, because sometimes you get accustomed to what you're doing, right? And eventually it's like it's sort of the analogy of like walking into a smelly kitchen. You walk in and you're like, wow, that smells horrible. And then after 15 minutes, you don't notice it anymore, right? And so if you're going down a path that you don't enjoy, at first you're like, this stinks, this stinks, this stinks, this stinks. At some point, you might just be like, well, yeah, I mean, it's not great, but I don't think about it that much anymore. It's just kind of my life, right? So you want to be careful with the decisions that you're making. And let's be honest, right? Like life is short. You want to make decisions that optimize the enjoyment that you're getting out of things. So, like, when you can, I know not everybody has the liberty to be able to do this, but like, it's like maybe your parents are like, you have to be a doctor, you have to be a lawyer, whatever. And so maybe you
Yeah.
don't have that freedom. But if you do, I think it's worth sitting down with yourself and saying, what are my interests? What might I get some excitement out of? What am I passionate about? Let me try to follow those things. Because eventually, even if they don't lead to some career where you make millions of dollars, at least you'll enjoy yourself along the way. And that's a big piece of mental health as well.
Yeah, yeah, couldn't agree more, man. I can totally see the similarity of you and me. I also interested in talking to people, different kind of people. So that's why I started my podcasting journey. When I started, I wasn't thinking that how much I will earn through this by doing this. I never thought about this, to be honest. This is something which I truly enjoy doing. If you do everything for the money, then you kind of lost. I mean, which thing you will be do for yourself, just to get peace.
Yeah, and it
Yeah,
is challenging, right? I'm
yeah,
not dismissing the fact that life is expensive. We have to put food on the table. We have to pay rent, all that sort of stuff. At the same time, right? It's a balancing act. Being like, which side of the seesaw are we on? Are we optimizing all the way for money? Are we
yeah, man.
optimizing all the way for excitement and enjoyment?
Yeah,
Usually, like most things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And so it's like, yeah, you might have to work a job that like you feel just okay about. But then that job allows you to do things like, a podcast like this, where you then reap additional enjoyment or most of your enjoyment. And it's like you optimize the situation that you are in, you do the best that you can. That's all you can really ask.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I just remind a quote from SRK, the Shahrukh Khan, is an Indian actor. He said that don't become a philosopher before you become a rich.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so coming to your book, could you tell us about your book, Get Out of Your Head?
Yeah, so let's focus on the first one. So, as you
Yeah,
alluded to, it's called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. How I look at it is it's the product of about a decade of my own experiences with anxiety. And what again, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. It's just me talking about my experiences. Is when I was in high school, I dealt with a lot of anxiety, taking exams, going to dances, track meets, basketball games, that sort of thing. I didn't really know what that was. I just knew that in those situations I was nervous. I didn't know the term anxiety. I didn't know, the nervous system and all kind of the inner workings and all that. I didn't know about panic attacks, or like I didn't have the lexicon for all of this. I was just like, I'm nervous all the time. I don't feel good all the time. Right. And so I went off to college and I was like, okay, whatever those feelings were, let's like try to leave them behind. This is a new start. Like, that nervousness, like let's get rid of it and just hopefully things will go better. And so very early on into college, I essentially had met this girl that I liked, and we were talking, and she came over one day. She had been drinking a little bit, I had not, and she was, when you drink, you have like a little liquid courage. You have maybe you say some things you wouldn't normally say, and so she was a little different than her normal self, and I was very nervous, and so like my heart is racing as she's coming over, and I can't really think straight. My palms are sweating and all that sort of stuff. And as soon as she comes over, she sits, she jumps right into my lap, and she just feels like my heart pounding, and she gets up. She's very like, put back by this, or taken aback by it, and it's just like, what the heck is going on? Like, you're shaking, you're freaking out, calling me all these names. Eventually just like screams at me and runs away. And it was, I never tell that story to speak poorly of her, right? Both of us were like 18-year-old kids. Like, neither of us knew what we were doing. But it was a very disheartening thing to go through, right? I had this narrative in my head of like, oh, I had all this anxiety in high school. I'm going off to college. It's going to be a better time. I'm going to leave all of that behind. And here I am a couple weeks into college, not going on a date, but having somebody that I like come over and thinking I'm going to have like, a nice night with her. And then I have a panic attack in front of her, and I'm sitting there the next day reeling, being like, I don't even know what that was, but it was so horrible. And clearly I'm not making the progress that I want to make, and that sort of thing. So very quickly on into college, I was like, it really hit me across the face to say, basically, you have something going on in your head, right? And that eventually I was like, okay, that's anxiety. You have to figure that out, because if you want to make progress in your life and in your relationships, like, this is the elephant in the room, and you can't just ignore it. And so, long story short, over the next 10-ish years, it was basically me. And I think I alluded to this in the beginning of the show, it was basically me trying to learn as much about mental health and about anxiety as I could, and say, okay, like, for example, I just read a book about anxiety, and the author said, here's some tactic that you can employ when you're feeling anxious to not feel as anxious in that moment. And so what I would do is I would kind of stockpile all those different tactics, and I would go to events that made me nervous, and I'd be like, okay, for example, the author just talked about box breathing, right? Which is basically, you think about sort of drawing the four sides of a box. So you're breathing in for 4 seconds, or, some number of seconds, and that's the first side of the box. You're holding that breath for another 4 seconds, let's say, and that's the second side of the box. You then breathe out for 4 seconds, and that's the third side of the box. And then you hold for another 4 seconds, and that completes the box. And so, a strategy like that, right, is designed to help you regulate your nervous system a little bit better when you're in the middle of that fight or flight state. And so what I would do is I would take these different tactics and I'd be like, okay, I have to give a presentation in class today and I'm very nervous, but I just went to therapy and my therapist told me about some other tactic. And so I'm going to go try that on for size. And over the course of 10-ish years, I basically sort of became my own guinea pig, right? And I was like, I'm trying out all these different things with the goal or the intention of improving my own mental health and regulating my own anxiety. And then eventually, once I felt as though I had enough experience on that front and had made some progress with my anxiety, I was like, okay, let's turn around now and turn these experiences into some content, which eventually became that first book that we're talking about now.
Hmm, that is very interesting, man. So I have few questions here. You mentioned that when you with her on that point of time, you kind of realized that you got the anxiety attack. Am I right? So if I can I call it anxiety attack? I can say panic attack, but anxiety attack. Am I right? So
Either
since
either anxiety or panic attack, yeah, either
okay.
one works.
So on that point of time, you are not familiar with the intricacy of the psychology, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So that
Yeah,
was like I was 18 at that point, still pretty
yeah.
young.
So you may not acknowledge that the thing which you experience in that point of time is an anxiety attack.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real scary things about anxiety, right? Is when you don't know what it is and your heart is racing as fast as it's ever raced, you think to yourself the worst case possibilities.
It's a
You
heart attack.
say, exactly. Am I
Yeah,
about to go into cardiac arrest? Right. And,
yeah.
it's, we laugh because we now know that that's not the case. But in those situations, you're so frightened that and you don't have that information. So you're like, what if? What if this? What if that? What could possibly go wrong here? And because you're in such a heightened state, your mind just latches on to really dark possibilities, such as having a heart attack. So, yeah, some of the real effectiveness of learning about anxiety, learning about psychology is just understanding that so much of this, even though it's really painful, is actually really normal. A lot of people deal with it. And once you come to that conclusion, you're able to talk yourself off of the cliff a lot of times, right? To be like, okay, this stinks. I don't want to experience this, but I understand why I'm having these feelings. I understand why my body is having this reaction. And to be honest, a good amount of people, statistically speaking, experience this sort of thing. So it doesn't mean I'm weird. It doesn't mean, I'm abnormal or an outlier or anything like that. And the more of that knowledge that you can assimilate into your mind, the more you can reassure yourself in the moment and not have that outsized negative reaction that drives the fear even further.
Yep. You mentioned that the people kind of thinking that this is something else. You are talking about the anxiety, you are talking about the panic attack. I can still see the stigma around the mental health. If you talk about the mental health, there is a people also think that you are talking about mental people, right? We can see the sense the stigma around it. So what's your take on the stigma?
It's a good question. I want to be cautious with this, right? Because there is a stigma and there's no doubt about it. I think
Yeah.
we've made progress with that stigma, but it's still like mental health is it's a wide label or like a broad category, right? So
Yeah.
within mental health, you have anxiety, depression, OCD, social phobias, arachnophobia, like all these different things, PTSD, schizophrenia, like, so the list goes on and on and on. And I think it's like a lot of the stigma came from, in the media, right? You think about a movie like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I think that was a book as well, that didn't do us any favors in the sense of like building or breaking the stigma, because you basically, the media drilled into us this notion that like anybody who has some issues on the mental health front or some struggles is quote unquote crazy or needs to be institutionalized, that sort of thing, right? And I'm not saying that you don't need some assistance, but the idea that like you're in a psych ward in a straitjacket, like that is part of where that stigma comes from. So now that like everybody or a lot of people in society are talking about mental health, I think that stigma is starting to break more and more, which is great. But at the same time, like, and I'm not trying to be flippant here. I'm really trying to be, what's the right word? Sort of like thorough, I guess. You think about like, unfortunately, there are folks who are affected by mental health, by certain conditions in a very drastic and negative way. And so maybe, as an example, somebody is having a horrible time and they are awfully depressed and they become manic and they become suicidal, right? And you've seen, really, it's really unfortunate, but you see stories in the news of people who are like, we then go back after something happens and we look at their journals and their online activity and that sort of thing. And basically they were driven to some state where they're like, I'm going to go commit some heinous act, shoot up a school or a grocery store or whatever. And so I don't think that we should be like forgiving of that, right? Because those are horrible acts and we want to make sure that those things don't happen. At the same time, right? And that's a product of mental health. At the same time, I think we need to intervene long before that happens. And that's where the stigma piece comes in a little bit more. So if we're saying if we're constantly saying, oh, whoever suffers from XYZ mental health condition is awful or needs to be institutionalized or whatever, then we're basically not giving those people the assistance and the aid that they need. And we're almost sort of pushing them closer towards those states where they're long gone and they're then committing these heinous acts. If we are more receptive to hey, people have their struggles, and what happens when people struggle? We help them and we talk to them and we give them the assistance that they need. The hope would be that in starting to break that stigma a little bit, people don't get as far down the line in a negative fashion as they could, and therefore we sort of prevent them from going to those really dark places. Again, I want to be cautious, or I was cautious with that answer, because what I'm getting at is we can't forgive the fact that people do heinous and horrible things, right? There's a stigma for some reason, but I would argue that a lot of that reason is the outdated stuff we saw in the media a long time ago. And that when we are more open about these conversations, we give people the opportunity to find the aid that they need, and hopefully, and I know this is a bit idealistic, but hopefully not reach those extremes that we're seeing, on the nighttime news, in our headlines and on our Twitter feeds and that sort of thing. So it's a touchy, difficult subject, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yep. Let's understand the anxiety and the panic attack a little more. What I'm thinking is, do you think, why people, getting the anxiety attack? You gave your example. In that situation, you get the anxiety attack, which you explained earlier. But what I'm asking you is here is that, let's say for an example, a person who lose something in Bitcoin, okay, he kind of lost everything, every money he has on Bitcoin. So in that moment, he will not be in stable condition, right? So that condition can be called as a anxiety, or it's a panic attack, it's something else. Actually, I'm asking a very rudimentary question. Maybe it is not
Sure.
directly related to that, but people often confuse with the what is exactly the anxiety and panic attack. Is it have to be necessarily the big thing, or it could be a very small thing also? Could you shed a light on it?
Yeah, there's a lot to answer here. How do I break this down? Let's talk about the Bitcoin example, right? And also bring some definitions into the space. So at a broad level, I would say that anxiety is future-oriented fear, right? And it's such a broad term, but it's basically, okay, let's also step back and provide one more definition. So fear is essentially you being in front of a threat in this present moment, and the possibility that something could go horribly wrong right now or in a second, right? Anxiety becomes the version of that, but on an extended timeline. And so the concrete example I give is fear is the feeling that you feel when you are standing in front of a hungry predator, right? And that's sort of if you look at the evolutionary science, that's where all of this stuff, the nervous system, the fight or flight response, where all of that emerged from, was to say, we need to stay alive, we need to stay away from hungry predators, we need to stay safe. And so we have these mechanisms in our bodies that say, you're in front of a tiger who is foaming at the mouth. Yeah. That's not a good thing either. Run as fast as you can from that tiger, or fight that tiger to the death, right? And so that's a very ancient response, and that's the fear response. Anxiety is the equivalent of thinking about being in front of a proverbial tiger in a day from now, an hour from now, a month from now, a year from now. And so if we then think about the Bitcoin example, right? There's one piece of, okay, that person lost their life savings in Bitcoin, or however you want to phrase it. There's an immediate piece that is regret and maybe some shame and disappointment and grief. But there is also that fear and anxiety response, in the sense that they say, right, totally rightfully so, they say, I just lost all my savings. What is going to happen, right? And then the mind starts to project all these different things. So you say, previously I had one Bitcoin, which today in US terms is worth $100,000. I lost my my ledger account, or I the thumb drive that my Bitcoin
Yeah.
was on, my cold wallet. I somehow fudged a private key and I sent it to the wrong address, whatever you want to say. But you had one Bitcoin and now it's gone. And again, obviously there's a loss there and there's a grief there. So there's a lot of feelings going on at once. But the anxiety piece is saying, I had $100,000. Now I have zero. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen a month from now? What's going to happen a year from now? As in, I think I just ruined my future, but I don't know for sure yet, right? Because in that moment, even though it's a huge loss and a scary, grief provoking thing, we don't know for sure that, like, we won't find a job in a couple days and start making some more money and, come into some fortune at some point, right? Like, life is pretty unpredictable. All we can know is that we did just lose $100,000, and the plans that we maybe had for ourselves of, as a couple examples, maybe we said, oh, I thought that Bitcoin was going to turn into $2 million and I was going to be able to retire. Or I thought I was going to sell that tomorrow and I would be able to put a down payment on a condo or something like that, So the brain quickly does this exercise of saying, now that I went from $100,000 down to zero, what does that mean? And what is going to play out as a result of that? So that fear is saying, am I going to be able to pay my bills tomorrow? And am I going to be able to buy a house with my spouse? Am I going to be able to, another question is my spouse going to get so mad at me, or my significant other going to get so mad at me that they leave me, right? Because I just blew the family fortune, that sort of thing. So it's really like boiling it all the way down. And this is another term or definition that I will put in my first book a lot, is like, anxiety stems from uncertainty, right? If you are totally certain about something, even if like for no good reason, there's no stimulus, there's no mechanism that goes into your mind to spin the wheels and say, what if, right? So as a concrete example of that, if you say like, hey, I have an exam today, I know the material cold, I've actually seen the exam, I know the questions, I know with absolute fact I'm going to get 100 on this exam. There's no real great reason for your brain to then go into fight or flight mode and be like, oh, what's going to happen during the exam? What if I do this? What if I mess up? What if I break my pencil? You're just like, hey, guess what? I brought 12 pencils. No, I'm not going to break 12 pencils. I know all the answers. I'm going to go into the room. I'm going to write them down, and that's going to be that. But as soon as you start to put some uncertainty into the situation, that's where anxiety starts to creep up a little bit, right? So in that same example, you say, oh, well, I actually only have one pencil and, it's starting to wear down quite a bit and there's no pencil sharpener in that room. So what happens if I can't write with the pencil anymore during the test? And, oh man, I should have studied more, but I was actually watching my favorite TV show last night. And so I don't know the material as well as I should. So I'm uncertain as to, my expertise on the material. Does that mean that I'm going to get a passing grade or a failing grade? And so anytime that uncertainty infuses into the situation, the brain is saying, hey, I see the potential for some negative outcome here. And therefore I need to run these scenarios of what will happen if this thing occurs, if that thing occurs. And it's frustrating because for us, we're like, brain, what are you doing? You're making me completely miserable. The difficult thing is that mechanism is still designed to protect us. The problem is that our world is so different now from the one that, that existed millions of years ago when these different mechanisms in our brains emerged, that it's very hard for us to see the quote unquote threats that we see today in the same fashion as a saber-toothed tiger that is, looking at us as lunch meat. And so it becomes challenging because our brains are designed for certain things, right? Running away from hungry predators. And yet a math exam, as scary as it can be, and the fact that, it may hold, you may have an exam that it could be making or breaking you, right? The difference between you getting an A in a course or getting into your dream college, that sort of thing. The frustrating part is that you can't fight with a math exam. You can't run away from a math exam and then diffuse the threat. All you can really do is try your best to regulate yourself and also to bring certainty into that situation via studying more, or having past experiences where you've done well in the past, and then you can reassure yourself more. So I know I've talked a lot in regards to that one question about the Bitcoin. The final piece, and feel free to kind of clarify things as I get to the end here, but the final piece was like, is that anxiety? Is that a panic attack? That sort of thing. I look at anxiety and I look at panic attacks, and I think a lot of people do, right? They're somewhere on a sliding spectrum of one another, as in, like, a panic attack is basically extreme acute anxiety. It's such strong anxiety in a specific moment that your brain is just like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, freak out. Does that make sense?
Yep, yep,
So
yep, yep.
if that situation is scary enough, emotionally charged enough, sure, yeah, you could absolutely go into a panic attack where, then those questions are like, did I just ruin my life? What's going to happen? And I wish I could be, more emotional about this, but it's not my own situation, so it's a
Mm,
little hard to do that. But if you're like, I just ruined my life, your brain is going to go into survival mode and be like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And if that anxiety becomes strong enough in that moment, sure, that can absolutely be a panic attack. And I think just to round this out, right, is like when you even think about a panic attack or you ask people about panic attacks, again, it's real. Like, sure, there are definitions of panic attacks and symptoms associated with them and that sort of thing, but everybody experiences anxiety and also panic in slightly different ways, right? So like, to one person, being so anxious and having a racing heart is a panic attack. To somebody
mhm,
else, being so anxious that like they can't think straight and yet their heart is not racing at all, that's a panic attack. For another
mm.
person, they might just throw up. Like, all it's basically, anxiety is a collection of symptoms, and for some people those symptoms show up in one way, and for other people they show up in a different way. It kind of comes down to the intensity, the severity, the duration, and all that
Mm.
sort of thing. I guess I'll just round it out by saying, if I lost a Bitcoin, yeah, I think that's pretty warranted to have a panic attack.
Yep, yep, yep. That is very detailed and interesting answer, Brian. The gist what I'm getting is it is like the more you rational, the more the anxiety will go away. But and at the same time, you had to be convinced that you what you are doing, what you are thinking is correct. The result not must to be 100% correct, but you have to be have that conviction within you. The more you convince, the lesser the anxiety will attack you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one thing that I want to clarify that is like, it's very tricky. And
Mhm.
we've sort of alluded to it throughout the conversation around engineering and kind of saying to ourselves like,
Yeah.
hey, if we can bring our engineering oriented or engineering mindset to anxiety, to mental health, to happiness, to life, we can figure it all out, right? And although, like, to some degree, right, you can learn about anxiety and mental health and you can decide what is useful and what is not useful, at the end of the day, like, these are still emotions, right? Anxiety is, I would say it's an emotion. It's also more than
Yeah.
that, but it is an emotion, right? And you can't really reason with emotions. You know what I mean? You kind of just have to let them work through. How do I phrase that? You kind of have to let the emotions run their course or kind of like flow through you, if you will. So, I mean, you might be able to use them in some capacity, but sitting there and like trying to negotiate with anxiety, that doesn't usually work, right? So the rationality piece, there's a couple things there. One is you almost have to understand, get to the point where you realize that anxiety is not always rational and it is an emotion. So you can't necessarily negotiate with it. And the more that you try to negotiate with it, the more that you try to solve it, often the more trapped you get inside of it. And that's sort of akin to this paradigm. People will often say the happiness trap, which is basically the more that you focus on your happiness and try to cultivate your own happiness, the less happy you are, right? The more that you're waking up and saying, well, today I'm a 5 out of 10 on happiness, and tomorrow, okay, 6 out of 10, and the next day 4 out of 10. It's like asking the question of whether you are happy or not actually makes you feel a little bit kind of miserable. And so in the happiness trap, essentially what folks and psychologists who are like, there's a book called The Happiness Trap, and a lot of people who follow that methodology or that book will say like, you almost have to do things that you enjoy, and then happiness becomes a byproduct of that, rather than necessarily being like, okay, happiness, let's go find you, that kind of thing, right? So on
Yeah.
the anxiety front, it becomes a similar notion where, rather than saying like, where's anxiety, where's anxiety, where's anxiety, let me uproot it, you almost have to take a different approach, right? You have to say, okay, I understand that this is an emotion, and rather than fighting with this thing, I might let it run its course. I might look at it in a different fashion. I might use it in a productive capacity. So another thing that I want to bring about, this was kind of part two of the rationality piece, right? Is, so I will often say, and again, none of this is to toot my own horn. A lot of this stuff I have gleaned from other books and resources and all that. I didn't come up with this information, but I often say that anxiety is, it's like the dance between our thinking brains and our feeling brains gone wrong. And if you dig a little bit deeper, So that's basically your prefrontal cortex and then your amygdala, or the fear center of your brain, collaborating with one another in an unhelpful fashion. So what does that really mean, right? Is there's some threat in front of you, and by virtue of seeing that threat and perceiving it to be threatening, the fear center of your brain, your amygdala, says, I'm alert now. Okay, I'm scared now. We need to do something, right? And then that amygdala can hijack us, right? As in hijack our thinking brain, our rational brain, and convince us, oh goodness, this is a serious threat. We're in big trouble here, right? And when we start, we kind of feed the process of then asking the questions ourselves, of being like, what if? What if this? What if that? Oh goodness, what's going to happen if I lose my job, if I lose my Bitcoin, whatever? And you kind of get this ping pong effect of the fear from the amygdala drives these scary questions into the prefrontal cortex. We ask these questions of ourselves, which then drives more fear. And so not only do you get more scary thoughts and all that, but you also get stronger physical symptoms. Your heart might start to race, your palms might start to sweat, you might get tunnel vision, you might get butterflies in your stomach, right? And you sort of get this anxiety synergy, is what I kind of like to say, right? And so obviously it's not, I say synergy because you take like the thinking part of your brain that is usually helpful, and the fear center of your brain, which is helpful in some circumstances, right? If you're standing in front of a lion, you put these two things together and they become this toxic combo. And so the rationality piece is basically saying that when you find yourself stuck in an anxiety spiral, you have to find a way to sever that tie, to be like, okay, fear center of my brain, I appreciate this, but I have to make it so that you're not feeding fear into my prefrontal cortex and making me miserable and then creating and perpetuating that spiral. And so some of the ways that we do that, not always that easy, but two easy ways to do that, two simplistic ways of doing that. So the first one is to like move your body and run, right? So pretend as though, even though you have a math exam in front of you today and you can't actually run away from that math exam, you can't fight with that math exam, pretend as though you kind of can. And I know it sounds a little weird, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to align yourself with the way that your amygdala works and the way that your nervous system works. And so if the nervous system basically says, I run away from threats or I fight with threats, again, even though you can't run away from or fight with a math exam, you can still run in general, right? And so when you're feeling that anxiety, get up out of your chair, do some jumping jacks, run around the block, expel some of that anxious energy, sever that tie between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And then hopefully once you've done that, that rationality piece comes back online. The part of your brain that allows you to think and plan all that then comes back online, and you can say to yourself, okay, I now see that I'm stuck, or I was stuck in the anxiety spiral. Now that I have my rationality back, I can do some other things to help me bring myself back towards calm. And again, you're not fighting with the anxiety. You're trying to sort of align with it in the way that your nervous system works, such that you then get your thinking capacities back. And you're like, okay, with my wherewithal here, I can then do these other things that I know typically bring me back towards a tranquil state. The other one, so I said there were two. There's obviously more than two, but the simple ones are you move your body or run. The second is you do some deep breathing, right? So when you're stuck in the fight or flight response, your nervous system is going crazy. Your heart is racing, your palms are sweating. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but you have basically a sympathetic nervous system activation. You want to get the parasympathetic nervous system activation going, which is essentially the rest and digest, or the feed and breed response in the body. It's the calming response in the nervous system, the opposite of the fight or flight. And when you do deep breathing, specifically when you get a long exhale, you activate that parasympathetic, part of the nervous system and begin to sever that tie between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So once you've done one of those things and you've gotten yourself a little bit out of the spiral, from there, again, that rationality piece comes back online and you're like, oh, I have my wits about me again. I realize I was doing these things that are not that productive for me. Instead of doing those things, continuing to do them, I'm going to go through some of the other tactics that I have. And now that, because I have that wherewithal, I'm better able to carry those tactics out. Whereas 10 minutes ago, when I was totally stuck in the spiral, me trying to rationalize things, like I just wasn't at that point in the progression yet. And so that wasn't all that helpful. So I know I give these long-winded answers, but I think that is hopefully a good way, a helpful way of framing things for your listener. And it's important, right? Because we're rational beings. We have that ability within us. The problem is that when we get that amygdala hijack, we're like, what do we even do now?
Yep. I'm about to ask you what you should do during the anxiety once you acknowledge that you are getting the anxiety and panic attack. But I guess you kind of read my brain.
Cool.
So, man, could you give us a demo the way you said the second step breathing exercise you have to do in a certain way? Earlier, you said, if I'm not mistaken, the box breathing or something you mentioned.
Yeah, so we talked about box breathing. That's just like one way of carrying out this tactic of getting some deep breathing, right? And why it's helpful for folks is one, it gives you something to focus on, right? The challenge with breathing is that you actually have to do it a specific way, and not one specific way, but I guess what I'm saying is there are ways that you could do it that are not helpful, right? So if
Mhm.
I were just doing this, right? If I'm like I'm going to breathe and I go that's basically hyperventilating, right?
Hmm.
And that actually is the opposite of helpful. That charges up my nervous system and gets me in a more frantic state. So, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get back towards that tranquil state, right? We need to slow the body down. So, one, when we pick up a tactic like box breathing, one, it gives us something else to focus on, which is great because when you're anxious, you're typically hyperfixated on some specific scary outcome, task, whatever it may be, right? In the Bitcoin example, I'm focused on the fact that I just lost $100,000 or one Bitcoin. I'm
Yeah.
focused on the fact that I think I just ruined my life. Obviously, that's a horrible outcome. We don't want anybody to experience that. At the same time, like in an anxious situation, and again, there are some situations that are kind of too powerful that are really hard for us to process. But let's just say we're anxious right now, and it's not the kind of like I just completely ruined my entire life sort of thing, right? When you're anxious, you're fixated on that negative outcome, and so if you are able to find a way to shift your mind, the focus of your mind to something else, you're feeding messages into your brain that are different, that are not saying produce more fear, produce more fear, produce more fear. So just by virtue of saying, I'm going to go do my breathing and I'm focused on those numbers, right? Of breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, breathing out for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds. That is almost like what do I want to call it? It's something like a baby's rattle, right? The baby's crying, you give it a rattle, and now it has something else to look at and focus on. More like if we go deeper, the reason the breathing is important, right? Is basically when you do take a long breath in, you speed up your nervous system a little bit. So your heart will flutter at a slightly higher pace, faster pace. And then when you breathe out, as long as you're getting a deep breath out, and not just kind of the hyperventilation sort of thing, you slow your body, your heart, and your nervous system back down. And so what we want to avoid when we're feeling anxious is that action of hyperventilating or breathing in but not really exhaling as efficiently as we should be, and so we get that deep breath in, we speed up a little bit, we get that deep breath out, and we slow down. And the more that we do that, right, in that moment, the more that we're telling our body that everything is okay, or at least we perceive it to be okay. And the more that we reassure ourselves through not only the breathing but also then the co-occurring thoughts, the more we send those messages to the brain of like, okay, dude, like turn off the fear response. It's okay. It's okay. Right? That sort of thing. Not necessarily being like, shut it off, shut it off, shut it off, like in a panic state. It's more just getting back to that state of calm and being like, everything's all right. We're going to be fine. Not a big deal. Like that, getting back to that tranquil state. So when I say like different kinds of breathing, you don't have to box breathe. I just think that for a lot of people, they find it helpful because instead of being focused on that scary thing that's in their mind, they're focused on 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, right? So you're looking for ways to shift your focus. That's such a big part of anxiety. Did
Yeah.
I answer the question? Was that helpful?
Yeah. Of course. So it is like the calm way you have to do is not like you have to, I mean, breathe rapidly. It will be not be helpful. In fact, it will the opposite.
Exactly.
Another thing you earlier mentioned that we talk about the engineering perspective, how engineer kind of learn in a way so that that kind of easier for them to handle anxiety compared to the non-engineer. But as you mentioned, we don't want if somebody in the audience who is not an engineer, what they will feel, they kind of feel that shit, I am not an engineer, so that means I can't handle the anxiety or something like that. So for that, we want to say that nobody is immune to anxiety and panic attack.
Yeah, and to be honest, right, the engineering piece is more just like my own backstory of me saying I am an engineer. This is how I came to learn the methods
Yeah.
that I learned. in reality, there, if you read my first book, there's some slightly technical pieces, but I wanted to make sure that it wasn't like, hey, only engineers can read this, only
Yeah, yeah,
engineers
yeah.
can
Of course.
understand this. I was just taking concepts that I was like, hey, this helps strengthen my argument, and I try to present it
Yeah,
in a
man.
palatable way. But yeah, definitely to folks who are listening. Well, the sad thing is that you can experience anxiety if you're not an engineer.
Yeah.
The good news, or the positive thing, is that you can also get out of anxiety even if you're not an engineer. So yeah, definitely isn't meant to be like only for engineers. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
my history, my background, where I come from, and how the story emanates. So
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. I mean, this is something which I think that we have to clarify. That's why I bring that topic. But earlier you already cleared that. I'm just doing the extension to that, the thing which you already said earlier. Okay, man.
yeah,
So we are on the final segment of our podcast. This called Instant Insights, where I will ask you some quick question. You have to answer as fast as you can.
sounds good. I'll do my best.
Yeah. So are you ready?
Ready as it can be.
Yeah. Coffee or tea?
T.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Beach or mountains?
Beach.
City or countryside?
City.
Blue or green?
Blue.
Early bird or night owl?
Night owl.
Best way to start your day?
Going for a walk.
Introvert or extrovert?
I am firmly in the middle. Ambivert.
Most recent hobby you picked up?
You may have stumped me. I'm going to default to just saying writing, even though I got nothing.
Yeah, but you kind of writing since 10
I know.
years.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, not enough time for other hobbies.
What is your go-to stress relief method?
Running.
Travel back in time or forward in time?
Definitely backwards.
You want to experience the history,
I just don't think I want to see the future
future.
that bad.
Best way to spend a weekend?
Weekend, I would say like a sort of like a beach slash small town sort of like getaway with some good food and some nature, that kind of thing.
If you could have any dinner guest, dead or alive, who would it be?
Oh man, I think this is a tough one. I would like to have dinner with my grandmother again.
Best way to handle success?
Stay humble.
Best way to handle failure?
Stay hopeful.
Best gift you have ever received?
Wow, that's a tough one. I'll say Nintendo 64.
What is the one skill you wish you learned earlier in your career?
Man, tough one. I'll say like soft skills, like kind of the ability to like work better with teammates and like, kind of work through difficulties together.
Favorite book?
Favorite book, I'm going to cop out and say the entire Harry Potter series. Number 7 if you need a specific answer.
Favorite movie? Is it Harry Potter again?
The last movie is awesome. Favorite movie? Oh man, I should know this. I don't. Let's default to the last Harry Potter, sure.
Yep. Fun fact, Harry Potter, the last movie, The Deathly Hallows 2, is my first movie on the theater. It was my introduction to the theater.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, we have talked about this earlier. Most surprising thing you learn about anxiety?
Most surprising thing. I'm going to say that the fact that you can be anxious about seemingly nothing. Like you can just be anxious, and like without without any important thing on the calendar, you can just be anxious. And maybe, maybe there's a deeper reason for it, but like in your present state, you're like, I'm anxious and I don't know why.
Yeah. So can logic beat that anxiousness, that emotion?
I'm not saying no, but I think more so, right, going back to the stuff we talked about of like you have to find a way to get your amygdala to turn off. And like we go back to evolution and we say, why did that amygdala turn on?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it
yeah.
feels some threat.
Yeah.
So if we were back 2 million years ago and that amygdala turned on, we'd fight with the threat in front of us or we would run. There is no threat that we can fight with right now. So let's go move our bodies and see if it shuts off.
Yep, yep, yep. We are kind of programmed in this way. So, man, I will say a word. Okay, you have to say whichever, after hearing that word, you have to say whichever comes to your mind. Okay, it could be any word, or it could be any thought, or even a feeling. Okay,
Sure.
nature,
Trees.
food,
Thanksgiving dinner?
love,
Difficult.
trust,
Also difficult, but vital.
AI, artificial intelligence,
I don't know. Kind of scary, but also kind of helpful.
freedom,
Sometimes good, sometimes less good. Depends on what it is.
music,
Oh, music is the best. Music is an escape.
knowledge,
Knowledge, important, but also you don't want to overdo it.
friendship,
Friendship is a great, great feeling especially when you have a deep one.
social media,
Necessary evil.
success,
Kind of up to the person who's determining it.
peace,
Noble aim. Not sure if we'll ever totally get there.
efficient,
This conversation and engineering. Big O.
wisdom,
Wisdom is like one of the highest virtues.
travel,
Travel, I think of novelty and excitement.
chaos,
Chaos. Ooh, that just scares me.
2025.
2025. Almost halfway over. I hope it's a good rest of the year.
And so far, 2025 so far.
Mixed bag. Like I said, in Boston, the winter is pretty rough. We're on the way up though.
So, man, I have one final question of the podcast.
Great.
Oh, what is the best piece of advice that you have ever received?
Wow. I wish I thought about this one a little bit. I guess I'm gonna be a little cheesy on this one. I can't say that this is definitely the best piece of advice I've ever received, but the one that comes to mind right now, right, is like it's your life. You get to decide what to do with it, and you should, or like I think it makes sense to align it with your own values, right? If you're not living your own values, you're probably living somebody else's life. You're probably not all that happy about it. And it's a short life, right? And
Yeah.
I think you want to be able to look back and say, you did it the way you wanted to do it. You wouldn't change anything. You're content with that.
Yeah, man. So, Brian, that's the end of the podcast. Any final thought?
My final thought is that I'd like to sit down and get a glass of water. Hey everyone, I'm Brian Sachetta, and you've been tuning into Shree's podcast, The Billion Insights. If you enjoyed our conversation, don't forget to subscribe and like the podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave a 5-star rating. That would mean a real lot. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much for not only sharing your insight, but also showing us that emotional resilience can be learned, even by those who feel stuck, whether it's through code or conversation. Your mission to help others is truly inspiring.
Thank you, Shree. I appreciate those kind words. Thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, man. And thanks for joining us as well. And to our listener, if you want to know more about Brian Sachette and his work, be sure to check out his book, Get Out of Your Head book series. All the link in the description. Thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you next time on the Billion Insight podcast. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and stay curious. This is Sri, your host, signing out. Peace. So, man, that's the end.
Awesome.